Good morning. My name is Joe Reingold, and I am interviewing Joram Wolanow this morning. It is Wednesday, July 31st, 2019. Hello there. Hi, Joram.
Hi.
Tell us a little bit about what you know about your grandparents and your parents, their lives, where they lived, how long
Very
ago did they
interesting.
come here?
My parents came from Poland, where they actually lived, the ancestors, etc., lived since approximately 1885. Well, before that, they were in Belarus, in Minsk. Okay. My father and his family lived in Warsaw, and my mother and her family lived in a small town, maybe about 60, 70 miles away from Warsaw, in a town called Reingold. In 1932, my mother was a leader of a group of kids that were scouts. And in 1932, the entire group, my mother and another person, migrated to Israel. And they did it legally because, there was a British blockade.
Right.
Across it wasn't that intensive in those days, but they had legal papers and they settled in Israel. My father, on the other hand, who lived in Warsaw, experienced a great deal of anti-Semitism, and he got tired of all of that, of being beaten up in the streets and called dirty Jew, etc., etc. Things were not very pretty then. In 1938, he decided he's just going to leave. Of course, his parents were against that. But he went ahead and he hitchhiked to Venice in Italy, where he boarded a ship that actually went through the British blockade illegally. And the way he told me the story is they came close to shore, jumped into the water, literally swam ashore, and were hidden in a safe house by a group led at that time by Truppeldor. And the following day he was shipped to the Dead Sea, and where he worked for approximately a year, in 1938, 1939. After that, he moved to Tel Aviv, where the family introduced him to my mother, and that was 1940. Okay, the war in Europe was raging. Of course, the news of what was going on was not available at that time, but they settled in Israel. My brother, who was the oldest of the three children, was born in 1945. I was born in 1940. No, I'm sorry, he was born in 1941. I was born in 1944, and my sister was born 6 years later. My sister, by the way, after she got married in the United States, picked up, went on a honeymoon in Europe, and settled in Jerusalem. So that is essentially my story. From my mother's family, practically everyone perished in the Holocaust. On my father's side in Warsaw, only his sister survived because she was hidden by a Polish soldier. During the entire war, he married her after the war, and they moved to Detroit, Michigan. And by the way, that was the germination of how my father and my family came to the United States. Because in those days, you needed an affidavit for someone who would support you. They didn't want people coming in and becoming burdens of society. So that was essentially the history of my family. My sister, by the way, who lives in Jerusalem, spent quite a few years and built up an incredible family tree that in fact goes back to the 1800s, and it has hundreds and hundreds of our family members in that big family tree, and she's still at it.
That's great.
Yep.
Wonderful. And your brother?
My brother, the entire family came into the United States little by little. That's the old joke, how did they come? Little by little. My father came to the United States in 1956.
Okay.
All by himself. He established himself in New York. He had a visa, and it was okay for him to do it legally. My brother came a year later as a student. My sister, my mother, and I came 6 months later. And we all settled in Brooklyn initially. We worked very hard for 2 years and were able to save enough money to buy a home in Queens, in the Jamaica neighborhood.
Okay.
And we all worked at it, even my sister. That was a story of its own. I was married in 1969 to a Barbara Fine, and we moved to Long Island. So that was sort of my immediate history.
Okay. Did you have any children with Barbara?
I had 2 children, one boy and one girl. The girl is the oldest. She, at the moment, lives in New York with my ex-wife, Barbara, as well as my son. They both have psychological issues.
Oh, okay.
My daughter, her name is Beth, had 2 children here in Dallas. And we, Carol and I, my wife and I, have been raising those 2 grandchildren for the last 17 years. So they live with us. They essentially became our kids.
Right.
So, that's...
Did you, after high school, what were your plans? What did you do?
I was practically the first one to go to college in my family. Both my mother and father, because of the situation in Poland, had very, very little education. My father was in the leather good business. He was making luggage. That was his expertise, which he then did in Israel as well. My mother was always a homemaker. So education was very important in our family. My mother and father realized how important it was. I went to college at Queens College, which is part of the University City of New York. I graduated with a physics degree and then went on to have a master's degree in engineering and management. And then I went on to my career. So that was my education.
Okay.
That was the plan.
What was your career?
I was involved in many engineering projects, essentially for the next 25, 27 years. And I had a ball doing that. I was involved in telecommunications, in microwave engineering, in satellite communications, in cryogenics, in thermodynamics. I had my hands in so many different disciplines, and I just had a lot of fun. In fact, I even had one patent.
Oh, great. That's great.
I worked for several private small companies that were on the leading and cutting edge of engineering, lasers, microwave communications with satellites. And my last business adventures, if you will, was with Siemens, which is a German company, where I was an engineer, and then I went into salesmanship of telecommunication equipment. One very, very interesting thing that benefited me during my professional careers is that I got to travel all over the world. Many, many, many times, living out of suitcases.
Not everybody likes that, but...
Not very. In fact, on one occasion, I traveled from New York to India, excuse me, which takes quite a bit of time, about 20-something hours. When I landed, I discovered that the person that was going to meet me evidently left to Paris. And I literally, within 5 hours on an airplane going back again.
Oh.
So I had a lot of adventures.
Yeah. So you did that for many years. You were still in New York most of this time?
All of the time
All
I
of
was
the
in
time.
New York.
So how did you get here?
Very interesting. My brother, who was working in a company in New York that manufactured and sold industrial and commercial washing machines. Okay. Guy gained a great deal of experience in this business. He was in sales. And he saw Dallas back in 1979, 1980, which I understand was one of the hottest summers, he tells me. He learned that Dallas was an up-and-coming city and there was very little representation in that industry. So he and a partner moved to Dallas. And over the years, he developed a business, and he still is here doing the same thing. And back in 1989, he called me up and says, "Why don't you move here? Why don't you pick up and go? You're always working for someone else, you know, and so on. Why don't you come? Let's go into business together. We'll make a dry cleaning plant." So I said, "Dry cleaning? I mean, the only thing I knew about dry cleaning is the Jefferson, you know, on television." And so I did that. I moved to Dallas in 1989. I stayed with my brother for quite a few months. We built a dry cleaning store not too far away from here on Montfort. Okay, and I learned the business. And then for several years we expanded the business. I had very little sleep doing that. And one consequence of moving to Dallas is that my first wife, Barbara, and the kids were going to follow me approximately a year later after I established the business and got up on my feet. And regretfully, she changed her mind. She decided to stay there. And 7 years after that, we were divorced. You know, even though she fought tooth and nail against it. Oh. And I became a free agent again.
And what did you do? You plunged into the social scene?
The very next day that the divorce papers came in the mail, I opened up the Texas Jewish Post. Okay, and in those days, there was one page was dedicated to personals.
I remember.
You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
And I wrote 5 letters to 5 personals that appeared to be interesting. That's how I met Carol.
Wow, success.
It was success.
That's great.
And we dated for 2 years. We got married in 1998 at Tiferet, Israel, by Rabbi Yitz Cohen. Okay. And 3 or 4 years later, we acquired 2 babies, which were my grandchildren. Helen was a girl, was 2 years old at the time, so I got to learn how to change diapers all over again. Carol didn't want to touch them. And Zachary, who was 4, okay, came and lived with us. Why? There was an issue with parental care. Child Protective Services got involved and awarded us custody of the children. And we've raised them since then.
You must have a lot of strength.
It was wonderful.
Okay.
But the interesting thing is that when people learn about this experience of ours with grandchildren, they say, wow, it must have been very difficult, but I absolutely disagree, as well as my wife, Carol. It actually opened up so many doors and windows for activities, PTA, you know, Akiba Academy, also, you know, schools, etc. And of course, we're still at it. You know, Helen, who is now 18, is going into a second year at SMU.
Wow, great.
You know? And Zachary has a job. He's 20 years old now.
Wonderful.
It was.
And they're still, are they still living with you?
They're still living with us,
okay.
yes.
All right. So what organizations have you joined as a family or as a couple here in Dallas?
Okay, we joined and belonged to quite a few organizations. In fact, more so in the last 6 years, 5-6 years since Carol retired, and I'm sort of semi-retired. For example, Carol was on the board of Akiba Academy, representing grandparents, by the way. She's on the board of Hillel. She's on the board. She was on the board and still very active in the Hebrew Free Loan Association. She's on the board of Sha'arei Tefillah. I was the president of Tiferet Israel for several years, about 10 years ago. Both of us belong to Hadassah. We are on the board of Bnei Zion organization. And I hope I didn't miss anything. I'm sure there are others that we're involved in. And we're active in all of them.
That's
and we love it. We love it. It gave us an incredible exposure to the entire Jewish community of Dallas. We know so many people, and we befriended so many wonderful people as a result of being involved in all those organizations.
Are you involved in any civic organizations or mostly Jewish?
Mostly Jewish.
Okay.
Mostly Jewish, yes.
I'm just curious, how has Dallas changed? What do you see from when you got here until now?
30 years ago, the major change is that the Jewish community expanded exponentially. Synagogues proliferated. In those days, Oratora didn't exist. Sha'arei Tefillah didn't exist yet. That was before they became independent. And there were very, very few synagogues. Now, the selection is so broad and wide that it is just remarkable. It's changed. Besides, years ago, 30 years ago, where we live now, in the Hillcrest Royal area, was kind of way out of the city area. Now we are smack in the middle of it,
Right.
as the city has grown in all directions. It changed a lot.
Yeah. Well, as our organization can attest to, the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, it's grown crazy, really. But it affords people the opportunity to pick and choose whatever they want. There's something for everybody here.
Well, now that you mention it, both Carl and I, and by the way, I failed to mention that Carl was on the board of Dallas Kosher, which I believe has the office at the Federation. We support many Jewish organizations, including the Dallas Historical Society, the Holocaust Museum, for Education and Tolerance, and I probably cannot mention, so many of them that we're involved in support.
That's fantastic.
That's our life.
And you said you're still working.
I am still partially working because I own a business, but I have a great deal of free time, which I enjoy and devote to a lot of different activities. For example, one of the things that I've done for quite a few years is every Friday afternoon, Rabbi Wolk, I, and two other young teenagers, we performed the Shabbat service at what is now Crystal Creek, used to be the Legacy,
Right.
and used to be the veranda before that. And we've been doing it for a good solid, I think, 8 years now, 8 to 9 years. Continuously every Friday.
That's quite a
And
mitzvah.
what is my role? I play the piano.
Wonderful.
That's another part of the education. One of the things that really affected my life and gave me an appreciation for classical music is that I also went to Juilliard, and my major was piano. But then came time to decide if I want to be a klezmer or I want to be a physics major, and I chose the latter.
But you still perform all over.
I play. I don't know if I perform, but I enjoy playing.
Right.
If there are listeners and there's a piano, I'm there.
That's great to take with you throughout your life. Can you think of anyone that you can point to and say they were your role model throughout the years?
Throughout the years, apart from my wife, Carol, a person that has become a major role model in my life is Rabbi Yaakov Tenenbaum, who I considered my personal rabbi and my teacher. And one of the things that influenced me is for the last 9 years, in fact it was published as a major story 2 or 3 weeks ago at the TJP. For 9 years we held classes in our home every Friday morning at 7:45 with several people who are coming, and we've been learning the deep meanings of Tehillim, Psalms. And we've been doing it for 9 years. And at the rate that we're going, it'll probably take us another 20, 30 years before we're done.
Okay.
And I admire Rabbi Tenenbaum tremendously. He's a Renaissance man with an incredible broad knowledge, not just of religion, but culture, societies, literature. I admire him, and he's been my role model.
How did you first learn about him or meet him? Do you remember?
Yes. Years ago, I think, about 9-10 years ago, he was teaching every Thursday morning, I believe, the parasha of the week or some other Jewish subject in the lobby of Akiba Academy for parents that dropped off their kids at 8 o'clock and chose to stay for another hour to learn with him. And since our grandkids went to Akiba, I stumbled on it, joined it, and 9 years ago we moved it to our home, and we've been doing it ever since.
Fabulous.
That's how we met.
Can you think of something, I know it might be hard to think of it or pinpoint it, but something in your life that you are truly the most proud of or very proud of?
Oh, I mean, this is hands down. I don't have to think very hard. Raising the 2 grandchildren was not just life-changing, but an experience that really educated me, gave me a lot more appreciation for life, and affected me deeply. I mean, hands down.
All right. Has your family in general expanded? Nieces, nephews, anybody married? Anybody? Who else is here in Dallas? Anybody else still?
Good question. Well, my brother lives here.
Okay.
His name is Avner. Clearly, his last name is Wolanow. And his wife's name is Carol. Also, Carol. But there is one slight difference. My Carol has an E at the end of her name. And was coincidental that some years back, after we were married, she went to a doctor. And they pulled out the other Carol's chart.
Oh.
And she has to be very careful now whenever she makes an appointment. Make sure that it is I and not the other one. I have a cousin who lives here, and he also came because my brother enticed him. He lived in Israel. He was born and raised in Israel. And he's very much involved in my brother's business. Selling, servicing, building laundromats, selling washing machines, servicing hotels, laundry establishments, etc. So he lives here in Dallas. My cousin lives here in Dallas. My daughter, by the way, Beth, when I first moved to Dallas in '89, she followed me a year later. And she lived in Dallas for 28 years. And about 2 years ago, she moved back to New York. They had some difficulties. She and her husband had some difficulties. But that is the extent of my family here in Dallas.
Who is still in Israel? Anybody?
Big family.
Yeah.
My sister, her name is Ditza. Her last name is Werther. Werther, by the way, in Yiddish means, words, like writer. Okay. She lives in Jerusalem. And both Carol and I have visited her dozens of times In fact, we just came back from Israel, and we have several close cousins. We have a very extended family, you know, like second cousin, third cousins, and so on, of course.
Right.
As they kind of evaporate into the cloud, they change names as they get married and so on. And my sister is responsible for keeping track of all of that. We also have family in England. We have family in Argentina, of Holocaust survivors, by the way, in Buenos Aires, which Carl and I visited earlier this year. And we have family in Spain. We have family in Portland, Oregon. So we're all over the place.
Good places to visit.
Lovely places to visit.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Joram, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
Moving to Dallas 30 years ago was the best decision that I've made. Number one, life is so much more pleasant here in the East Coast. I don't mean to berate the East Coast, but if you ask someone on the street, by the way, what time it is, they're just going to look at you and walk away. Here, at least, they stop and tell you what time it is. Life is much more pleasant. People are much more hospitable and sociable here. We really appreciate being here. And my plan is to continue living here.
Staying here.
That's what I can add.
All right.
We love it here. We just love it here.
Well, we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.